My name is Jessica, and for as long as I can remember, I have felt like an afterthought in my family. Growing up, everything was always about my younger sister, Betty. She was the favorite, the perfect child who could do no wrong. Betty was the daughter my parents had always dreamed of. Me? I was the quiet one, the bookworm, the girl who preferred solving math problems instead of going to parties. I loved learning and was good at it, but in a family that cared more about charm than intelligence, I often felt invisible. I remember one day when I was 13 and Betty was 11. We were at a family barbecue, and I had just won a regional spelling bee. I was so excited to share the news. Mom, Dad, guess what? I ran to them, holding my certificate. I won the spelling bee. My mom glanced at me, but her eyes quickly went back to Betty, who was doing cartwheels on the lawn. "That's nice, dear," she said without much interest. Then she turned to Betty. "Sweetie, be careful. You might get grass stains on your new dress." I stood there, holding my certificate, while everyone cheered for Betty's cartwheels. No one asked about my achievement. No one cared.
It was always like that.
Betty got new clothes, while I got her old ones. She got dance lessons, while I got a library card. She got praise and attention, while I got used to being ignored. As we grew older, nothing changed. Betty became a beautiful and popular teenager, full of life. I spent more time in my books and numbers, finding comfort in a world where hard work mattered more than charm. "Jessica, why can't you be more like your sister?" became something I heard all the time. And right after, my parents would turn to Betty and say, "Darling, you're perfect just the way you are." I tried not to let it bother me. I told myself that one day, my hard work and intelligence would pay off. One day, I would prove that I was worth something too. When I started high school, I focused on my studies more than ever. I wanted to do so well that even my parents couldn't ignore my achievements. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't compete with Betty's popularity. In my junior year, I won the state math competition. It was a tough contest, with the smartest students competing against each other in a test of numbers and logic. When they announced my name as the winner, I felt proud and hopeful. Finally, I had done something truly amazing. That day, I rushed home with my trophy, excited to share the news. But when I walked through the door, I saw the usual scene, my parents fussing over Betty, who was trying on a new costume. "Mom, Dad, guess what?" I said, out of breath from excitement. "I won the state math competition." My mom glanced up briefly and gave me a small smile. "Oh, that's nice, dear. Betty, honey, turn around so we can see the back." My dad didn't even look up as he adjusted Betty's costume. "Good job, Jessica." "Betty, are you sure this fits? It looks a little tight on the shoulders." I stood there holding my trophy, feeling crushed. "But it's the state competition," I said softly. "I beat hundreds of other students." "That's great, sweetie," my mom said, not really listening. "Betty has a big performance this weekend, and we need to make sure everything is perfect." And just like that, my big moment was forgotten. Again. I went to my room and placed the trophy on my desk. No one noticed it but me. It sat there collecting dust. When it was time for college applications, I gave it my all. I poured my heart into every essay, every form. I was determined to get into the best school possible, to prove, once and for all, that I mattered. Then the day came. The acceptance letters arrived. I had been accepted into a top university with a full scholarship to study financial analysis. My hands shook as I read the letter. Tears of joy and relief ran down my face. I ran to the living room where my parents were sitting with Betty. "I got in," I said, my voice shaking with emotion. "A full scholarship to study financial analysis at." Before I could finish, Betty suddenly jumped up. "Oh my God, I forgot. I need a new costume for my performance next week." Just like that, the spotlight shifted. My parents grabbed their keys and wallets, rushing to help Betty. I stood there, acceptance letter in hand, realizing once again, I would never be their priority. I stood in the empty living room, holding my acceptance letter, listening to the sound of the car leaving the driveway. My parents didn't come back until late that night, carrying bags full of Betty's new costume and accessories. No one mentioned my acceptance again. I focused on my studies at university, while Betty took a different path. She went to the local community college, more interested in her social life than school. Soon, she started dating Kevin, her high school boyfriend. Meanwhile, I found my place in the world of financial analytics. For the first time, my hard work and intelligence were noticed and appreciated. I made close friends who loved numbers as much as I did. It felt like I finally belonged somewhere. Back home, Betty's life went exactly how my parents had always dreamed. She married Kevin right after college in a big, expensive wedding that my parents paid for. I stood by as a bridesmaid, once again feeling like an outsider in my own family. A year later, Betty announced she was pregnant. When she gave birth, my parents acted like the whole world revolved around that hospital room. "We're grandparents," my dad kept saying, tears in his eyes. "Can you believe it, Jessica? Aren't you excited to be an aunt?" I was happy for Betty, truly. But I couldn't help feeling ignored again. I had just landed a job at one of the top financial firms in the city, but compared to Betty becoming a mother, it didn't seem to matter. 3 years later, when she had her second child, it all happened again. Betty was the perfect daughter with the perfect family. And me? I was just Jessica. The one who worked too much, didn't date enough, and didn't give my parents grandchildren to spoil. By the time I turned 31, I had worked my way up to senior financial analyst. I was respected by my coworkers, valued by my clients, and, for the first time, I felt truly proud of myself. To celebrate my success, I decided to buy a house. It was a beautiful one-bedroom home in a great neighborhood. It wasn't a mansion, but it was mine, bought with my own hard-earned money. The day I got the keys, I felt a sense of pride I had never known before. Excited, I invited my family over to see my new home. I thought that finally, my family would see what I had achieved, that they would be proud of me. When they arrived, Betty had her kids with her. My parents were busy fussing over their grandchildren while I showed them around the house. My mom's main comment was, "It's such a big house for just one person, isn't it?" I felt my heart sink. "It's an investment," I explained. "And now I have space for a home office." "Well, I suppose that makes sense," my dad said, but his tone made it clear he didn't really mean it. As they were leaving, I heard my mom whisper to Betty, "It's a shame Jessica doesn't have a family to fill that big house. But I suppose her career is important to her." A few months later, after I had settled into my new home, I got an unexpected invitation to a family dinner. I was surprised. My family often forgot to include me in gatherings, thinking I was too different or uninteresting. But I accepted, hoping maybe things were changing. When I arrived, my dad patted my shoulder awkwardly. "Jessica, good of you to come. Have a seat. We have something important to discuss." A bad feeling formed in my stomach. Important discussions in my family usually meant something good for Betty and something disappointing for me. Still, I sat down and forced a smile. During dinner, the conversation was all about Betty's kids and Kevin's job. I tried to mention a big project I had just finished at work, but before I could finish my sentence, Timothy started crying for more dessert. My words were ignored. After dinner, we moved to the living room. My mother cleared her throat. "Jessica, dear, we've been thinking." I tensed, unsure of what was coming next. "You're single and don't have children," she continued, as if she were talking about a serious problem. "And you have that big house all to yourself." "Yes," I said slowly, not liking where this was going. My dad spoke next. "Well, we think it would be best if you gave your house to Betty and her family." I blinked, sure I had misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "Give them the keys and move out," my mom said, as if she were asking me to pass the salt. "They need the space more than you do." I looked around, waiting for someone to laugh, to tell me it was a joke. But no one did. Their faces were serious. Betty sat there, looking pleased, while Kevin patted her shoulder as if to comfort her. "You're joking, right?" I finally asked. "Now, Jessica," my mom said in that condescending tone she always used when she thought I was being difficult. I knew what was coming next. "Don't be selfish, Jessica. Betty needs the space more than you do, my mom said. You're just one person after all. It's your duty as her sister, my dad added, as if that settled everything. Family helps family. I felt like I was living in some kind of twisted dream. But it's my house, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I bought it with my own money. I worked hard for it. Oh, come on, Jessica, Betty said, her voice overly sweet. You know how hard it is raising 2 kids in our tiny apartment. You'd be doing us such a big favor. I stood up, my hands shaking. No, I said, my voice growing stronger. Absolutely not. I'm not giving you my house. The room exploded. My parents started listing all the things they had supposedly done for me over the years. Betty went on and on about how hard it was raising kids. Kevin just sat there nodding, as if all of this made perfect sense. As I walked out, I heard my mom call after me. Think about it, Jessica. Don't be selfish. The aftermath. In the days after that awful dinner, my life turned into a mess. My parents had clearly told the whole extended family that I was selfish. Suddenly, relatives I hadn't spoken to in years started calling and messaging me, acting like they knew what was best for me. One afternoon, I got a call from my great-aunt Kimberly, a woman I hadn't seen since I was a teenager. Jessica, she almost gasped into the phone. I heard about your situation. How could you be so heartless? You're nothing but an old maid, saving money for no good reason. The next day, my cousin Gary, who I barely knew, sent me a text. Hey Jessica, heard you're being difficult. Why don't you just move to a remote island and live as a hermit? You're already an outcast and a loner anyway. 3 weeks after that horrible family dinner, I was at home, sick with a bad cold. Wrapped in a blanket, sipping hot tea, I heard a strange noise at my front door. It sounded like someone was messing with the lock. My heart started pounding.
Was someone trying to break in?
I set my tea down quietly and crept toward the door, my legs shaking beneath me. Peeking through the peephole, I nearly gasped out loud. There, on my front porch, were my sister, my parents, and Kevin. Betty was kneeling by the lock, a hairpin in her hand, trying to pick it open. My parents stood nearby, keeping watch. Kevin stood a little farther back, looking nervous. Without thinking, I yanked the door open. They all jumped back, shocked. What the hell do you think you're doing? I demanded. My voice was hoarse from my cold, but I was furious. For a moment, they just stared at me, caught red-handed. Then, to my complete disbelief, my mother spoke. We thought you'd be at work. We were just going to move in. Move in? I repeated, stunned. You mean break in and live in my house without permission? Jessica, my father said, trying to sound reasonable. We knew you wouldn't call the police on us. We're family, after all. I looked past them and saw a car in my driveway, packed with boxes and suitcases. They had actually planned to move in behind my back. Get off my property, I said, my voice low and firm.
Now.
Or I will call the police. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, holding it up so they could see. Last chance. Leave now. They stared at me, disbelief all over their faces. Then slowly, they turned and left. I watched them drive away, my whole body shaking. Once they were gone, I shut the door, locked it, and slid down onto the floor, my back against the solid wood. Taking action. The very next day, I called a security company and had surveillance cameras installed around my house. These weren't just any cameras, they had a voice recording function, too. But technology wasn't enough. I had always wanted a dog, and now I had the perfect reason to get one. I went to the local animal shelter, determined to find a companion who could also help protect my home. That's where I met Buddy. He was a large mixed-breed dog with intelligent eyes and a cautious nature. The shelter worker told me his story. His previous owners had abandoned him for being too protective. But I could see the loyal, loving dog underneath. Buddy and I bonded quickly. At home, he was sweet and affectionate, always by my side. But the moment a stranger came near the house, he became a fierce guard dog, his deep bark warning anyone who thought about trespassing. I set up a comfortable kennel for him in the backyard, with a cozy doghouse and plenty of toys. He seemed to love it, often lying in the sun when he wasn't patrolling the yard. For 3 months, life was peaceful. Then, a work emergency called me out of town for the weekend. I didn't want to leave, but my neighbor, Mrs. Thomas, assured me she would take good care of Buddy. She adored him. She often brought him treats and took him for walks when I worked late. Feeling somewhat at ease, I left for my trip. But on the second night, my phone rang. It was Mrs. Thomas, and she sounded panicked. "Jessica, dear, there's been an incident," she said, her voice shaking. "Buddy, he bit a stranger. He chased them right out of the yard and down the street. The police are here now." I caught the first flight home, my mind racing. When I arrived, I walked into a scene straight out of my worst nightmares. My parents' car was parked in front of my house. Betty was there, looking both angry and smug. And to my horror, 4 police officers stood in my driveway. I approached carefully. "What's going on here?" One of the officers stepped forward. "Ma'am, we received a complaint about your dog attacking someone. Can you tell us what happened?" Before I could speak, Betty jumped in. "Her monster of a dog attacked my husband," she shouted. "He jumped right over the fence and bit him. He could have been killed." Suddenly, everything made sense. The stranger Buddy had bitten was Kevin. "That's not true," I said firmly. "My dog was protecting my property from intruders. If your husband got bitten, it's because he was trying to break into my house." Betty's face turned red with anger. "Liar! That beast needs to be put down before it hurts someone else." My parents, who had been oddly quiet, finally spoke. "We'll be pressing charges," my father said, his eyes gleaming. "And, of course, you'll have to pay for Kevin's medical bills." The officer looked between us, clearly sensing the family tension. "Ma'am," he said, "because of the complaint, we have to take your dog to the kennel for evaluation. If he's deemed aggressive, he may have to be put down." My heart sank as I watched animal control load Buddy into their van. He looked at me with confused, sad eyes, and I felt tears well up in mine. As the officers and animal control drove away, my mother stepped closer. In a low voice, she whispered, "You know, Jessica, all of this could have been avoided if you had just given us the house." She smiled cruelly. "It's not too late," she continued. "Give us the house and we'll drop the charges. Otherwise, well, you know what happens to aggressive dogs." I stood frozen, watching as my family drove away, looking smug and satisfied. Then, like a bolt of lightning, a realization hit me. The security cameras. I ran into the house, my heart pounding, my hands shaking as I turned on my laptop and opened the security footage from the previous night. Holding my breath, I prayed the cameras had captured what I needed. The video was crystal clear. I watched as Betty and Kevin crept up to my front door, looking around nervously. Then Buddy appeared on screen, his fur bristling as he let out a low growl. And then, I heard it, Betty's voice, clear as day. "Kevin kicked the dog. When it bites you, we can accuse Jessica and demand compensation. Or better yet, we can get the whole house in exchange for the dog's life." My stomach turned. On the screen, Kevin cruelly kicked Buddy. Caught off guard, Buddy reacted in self-defense, biting Kevin's leg. Betty let out a loud, dramatic scream, and Buddy immediately let go. The two of them ran away, leaving Buddy standing there, confused and upset. I felt sick. The confrontation. The next morning, I called my parents, keeping my voice steady. "I think we need to have a serious conversation. Can you all come over to my house?" There was a brief pause, then my mother's voice came through, overly sweet. "Of course, dear. We'll be right over." An hour later, they arrived, my parents, Betty, and Kevin, who now had a big bandage wrapped around his leg. As they walked into my living room, I could see the smug looks on their faces. They thought they had won. Betty started looking around, making herself at home. "We'll need to get rid of this ugly lamp," she said, wrinkling her nose. "And this couch? Not good enough. We'll replace it with something more family-friendly." I bit my tongue, letting her continue acting as if she already owned my house. Finally, I cleared my throat. "Before we discuss anything," I said, keeping my voice calm despite the anger burning inside me, I think you should watch something first. I gestured toward the large TV on the wall. Please, all of you have a seat. They hesitated, confused, but sat down. Betty perched on the armrest, looking annoyed. And then I pressed play. I watched as my family's faces turned pale. Their expressions changed from confusion to shock, and finally, to horror as they realized they had been caught on camera. Betty was the first to break the silence. It was just a prank, she stammered, her voice high with panic. We didn't mean any harm. Kevin quickly nodded, wincing as the movement hurt his injured leg.
Yeah.
Just a joke that went too far, he added. No need to make a big deal out of it, right? But my parents understood how serious the situation was. My father leaned forward, his face pale. Jessica, sweetheart, he said carefully, let's not do anything drastic. There's no need to make this public. We can settle this as a family. I couldn't help but smile, a cold, humorless smile that made them all flinch. It's a little late for that, don't you think? I said, glancing at my watch. And speaking of late, I believe we have some guests arriving. Right on cue, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to reveal 4 police officers, whom I had called earlier that morning. Perfect timing, I said, stepping aside to let them in. Officers, I have evidence of an attempted break-in and blackmail. What followed was a blur of activity. I explained everything to the police and showed them the security footage. The officers watched it closely, then turned to Betty and Kevin. A moment later, they were being handcuffed. As the officers read them their rights, my parents broke down in tears. Jessica, please, my mother sobbed. Don't do this. We're family. For a moment, I felt a small sting of sadness. But it was quickly drowned out by years of pain and resentment. You should have thought about that before you tried to steal my home and hurt my dog, I said coldly. I think it's time for you to leave. With tears in their eyes, my parents followed as Betty and Kevin were led to the police car. A fresh start. That evening, feeling lighter than I had in years, I went to the animal shelter to bring Buddy home. The moment he saw me, his tail wagged furiously, and he covered my face with excited kisses. Let's go home, Buddy, I whispered, hugging him tightly. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Betty and Kevin were arrested and taken to trial. With the clear security footage as evidence, they were found guilty of attempted break-in and blackmail. They were given a hefty fine, money that was awarded to me, and sentenced to probation. I decided to cut off all contact with my immediate family. However, I felt the rest of the family deserved to know the truth. I sent a detailed message to all our extended relatives, explaining everything that had happened. I also included copies of the security footage as proof. The response was overwhelming. Aunts, uncles, and cousins who had once called me selfish now sent messages of support and apology. Many were shocked by what my parents, Betty, and Kevin had done. Even the most forgiving relatives refused to include them in family gatherings. They were now outsiders. Moving forward. As for me, life only got better. I continued to do well at my job, finding more satisfaction in my work than ever before. Buddy and I settled into a peaceful routine, enjoying long walks in the park near our home. It was on one of those walks that I met Brian, a kind-hearted software engineer with a golden retriever named Bella. We hit it off right away, bonding over our love of dogs and our similar experiences with difficult families. We exchanged numbers and started dating. Day by day, our relationship grew stronger.